Monday when we had 2 philosophers in a row, remember I said, don't worry, there won't be any more philosophers till Friday. That moment has come. However, I realized as this moment drew near that Andrew Light is not simply a philosopher. His previous position was in philosophy and public policy at the University of Washington. He's just taking a new position now at George Mason University, which is in philosophy and environmental policy. Not only that, when he moves to Washington, D.C., which he's, I think, just done, right? He will also have a position at the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank in D.C. So Andrew Light is no ordinary philosopher. Andrew Light started his career actually right here at the University of Montana, and organized what was then probably the largest eco-feminist conference that had ever happened and may have ever
university.
Yeah. May have happened since, and I was lucky enough to meet Andrew right around that time. What Andrew's done since then, it's sort of interesting to reflect on as a philosopher. Andrew moved from Montana to New York City and really established the field of urban environmental ethics. You know, you think oxymoron, urban environmental ethics, but it's not an oxymoron at all. You know, the idea that there are important environmental things to say from cities it's something that we really owe that field to Andrew Light. The other thing that Andrew did is he made important the field of environmental pragmatism. Environmental pragmatism very roughly says, only do as much theory as you need to do to solve the important environmental problems. And you may have realized that philosophers tend to sort of get a little stuck in these abstract worlds and these abstract debates. And to the extent that environmental philosophy has not done that, we owe that to work Andrew Light. So we actually owe him quite a lot, actually. His biography is too long for me to talk about. There's a lot on it. And we're just very lucky to have Andrew Light talk to us today. The talk is a little different from what's written there in the title. It's not just on the environmental regulation of nanotechnology. It's about sort of moral issues as they appear in biotech, climate, and nanotech. There will be a couple of comments about the regulation of nanotechnology, but we're looking forward to this slightly broader talk. So Andrew Light, thank you.
Thank you all, and again, thanks to Christopher and Dane for inviting me here. This is the 3rd year I've come here to do the Environmental Ethics Institute and also do a little bit of work with this group. And this is my second home. I mean, I really love coming back to Missoula. So thanks again to you guys, and to meet my growing family, which was also very nice of you to do. So the talk Dane asked me to do. I've got sort of a wrap on environmental regulation of nanotechnology, which is a kind of a new issue, and it's a sort of a short wrap because it's very depressing. And I'm, you know, some of you know I've worked for the Obama campaign, so I'm kind of a hope monger kind of guy, and so I don't like to sort of end with things like that. So I am going to sort of talk actually quite a lot about that in sort of the last part of the talk, and then sort of what I think is a sort of a more hopeful or possibility for a conclusion on where we are with environmental regulation of nanotechnology, which is at this point kind of nowhere, at least in the US. But in talking to Christopher yesterday, I realized that you've had your big nanotech day, and talks today are sort of more synthesis sort of oriented. So I want to sort of put the environmental questions about nanotechnology in a broader context, not only in relationship to other emerging technologies, but also in relation to broader moral questions about really emerging technologies in general, that certainly of which nanotechnology is one of the most important. So the way that I'm going to do this is, first of all, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to make a distinction, which I'll clarify in a second, between extrinsic and intrinsic objections to biotechnology, which also mask onto nanotechnology and several other issues in emerging technologies. So I'll first go through how that works out and what I think the evolving debate has been over GM foods. And then secondly, move on to what I think is one way of resolving or attacking what are the most tenacious of the worries, moral worries about nanotechnology, and the hardest ones, I think, for scientists to appreciate, in my experience, and because they seem so fundamentally irrational. But I don't think they're irrational, I think they're irrational, and I'll say what I mean by that in a second. how we could possibly resolve those. Then we'll make a transition from bioethics to nanoethics, look at some similar problems, and then we'll come back again round to what are going to be called the extrinsic objections to nanotechnology. That's going to mostly focus on the environmental regulations of nanotechnology, or the lack thereof, and see if we can put all this together in a package. And it'll take me about 10 minutes to do this. Okay. So the first thing, let's talk about what are called the extrinsic and intrinsic objections to GM foods, which is really kind of a literature that's arisen, as you all know, this huge gap that emerged between the reception and response to biotechnology, especially genetic engineering, in the US and in the EU and Japan and other sort of places. Now, when we refer to extrinsic objections to these kinds of emerging technologies, what we're really talking about is the empirical stuff out there in the world that could, in principle, be verified. Primarily two areas. Number one, concerns about risk to human health, and number two, concerns about environmental risk. And a lot of the public debate on biotech, especially GM foods, has been about that. There's lots of good things about these extrinsic worries in the sense that you can actually, in principle, do experiments on them, right, and sort of come up with some kind of data, at least to do some kind of plausible risk models, as we all know, about the possible health and environmental risks of this kind of technology. That's sort of the good news. The bad news is that these kinds of concerns are very confusing, right, in the public mind. And in sort of thinking a lot about all the different explanations that people will give about the reception of biotech in Europe and what happened and why the EU shut down on this and why this has led to all of these debates on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades and the WTO and all the clashes that continue to evolve about this, the moratoriums on US products, all those kinds of things, which are really a chill not only on US investments and the economic sector here in agriculture, but also the really interesting work that people are going to do to actually produce some goods that have positive public, very clear positive public utility from biotechnology. You look at those things and the problems are very confusing. So one of the things that happened in the EU debate, I would argue, and economists will dispute this and go, oh no, it was just some excuse, about protecting European markets. And I think that just doesn't get to the depth of it. Also here is we have to remember that, of course, that there were two giant food scares that happened in Britain and through all of Europe, mad cow disease being one and hoof and mouth being the other. And the anti-GMO advocates who had various motivations for being anti-genetically modified organisms, genetically modified foods in Europe, really did I'll exploit in a very ingenious tactical way worries about those food scares to raise alarms, sometimes justifiable, sometimes I'm not certain were justifiable, about general food safety and about public trust in the regulatory apparatus, especially in Britain, but also in other EU countries. And then this was used as part of this was the thin edge of the wedge that got under the door that made it possible to take these very, very strong stances against GM foods in Europe. And now we can come back and talk about the degree to which that is a part, but I don't think anyone really looking charitably at the entire range of issues that evolved in that particular debate could deny that that was part of it. So these are the kinds of extrinsic worries that people have. What are the intrinsic worries? These are the ones that are harder to get at because generally speaking they're not empirical claims. They're broad metaphysical claims. They're claims about they use these sticky, awful terms that I wish we could just get rid of, right? But we probably can never do it, of what's natural and what's not natural. There's things like this. There's ones that are attached to questions, and I'll give you a sort of a quote from a very famous moral philosopher who's looked into this issue in a second, that they appeal to claims about human hubris. And of course human hubris, that we are sort of doing something that we ought not to do that goes beyond the nature of what humans should be able to do and change in the world, create new life, this kinds of things like this. We're going beyond some kind of realm that we've decided that humans should not go beyond. And it usually appeals to some notion of the divine as well, right? We don't want to be like the gods. And for those who hold the unnatural objection and the intrinsic, and these are again these intrinsic objections to GM foods, and they're intrinsic because they're inherent in the thing itself, the process, and no amount of empirical data that you want to present about the extrinsic worries will really mitigate these very, very much. There are certainly some cases where it might. And I will talk about the relationship between the extrinsic and intrinsic worries. But these worries are the hardest ones to get around. Now, there are lots of examples of this. A lot of people cite, for example, the work of Vandana Shiva in India, who has been a very strong advocate against GM foods for a variety of reasons, including these unnatural objections. And here's the famous philosopher that I was thinking of, who's commented at great length on GM foods. HRH Charles, the Prince of Wales. Strong public advocate against GM foods. And here is a quote. I believe that genetic modification is much more than just an extension of selective breeding techniques. Mixing genetic material from species that cannot breed naturally takes us into areas that should be left to God. We should not be meddling with the building blocks of life in this way, right? Now, I have a fundamental principled objection to this view. I have problems with this God premise idea, right? I have some worries about that one. And you can imagine, this is kind of a hard part about sort of this kind of objection being raised in the public realm. What do we do with it? How seriously do we take it? Yes?
What if you replace God with nature?
You could replace God with nature, and I still wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. That's the problem. Now, I sort of put this up there not because, I like to make you laugh, and Charles, a famous philosopher, ha ha ha, but he's actually a very smart fellow, I understand. But the thing is, it's a person in the public light who has an enormous amount of pull, right, on these kinds of issues. People take this stuff seriously, and it also is reflective of a broader public, upswing in Britain and throughout the rest of the EU and throughout the rest of the world about these things. So we have to be able to confront these kinds of questions. And one of the things I want you to start thinking in the back of your mind is these are very hard arguments to get around, right? Because you can't bring the empirical objections to them. Is there a relationship between the way that we approach worries about the extrinsic objections and the degree to which people will rely on these intrinsic objections? And my suspicion is that there is, right? So let me just sort of tease that out in a little bit more detail. So number one, I've just said, unlike questions of health or environmental risks, it's not verifiable or testable, this claim that Charles has made. And if you bring people, and I've been sat in, countless hours of focus groups with people, advocates on both sides, members of the, people from Dow Agro and Monsanto and Syngenta and the big organizations, and also anti-GM NGOs. And I've worked in this long project for 3 years with the Penn Center for Bioethics in Philadelphia, trying to come up with a code of ethics that could make everyone happy. And it was kind of a disaster, but I learned a lot about the sheer intransigence of some of these positions. And so if you bring forward claims, which all of you good scientists know, that it's arguably the case that when we go from high-tech plant breeding to genetic engineering, we're talking about a difference in degree and not a difference in kind. Like for a lot of these techniques, it does not work. That argument just simply gets no traction. Because there is this sort of, again, you're sort of dealing with not the world that we're all seeing necessarily, but a larger sort of world that's meaningful to people, and importantly meaningful to people. Secondly, the claim's not verifiable or testable because it amounts to what I want to claim is a folk metaphysical intuition that can, of course, be based in these larger religious systems. And so in a certain sense, one of the hurdles is you're basically asking people to give up on what might be their fundamental moral beliefs as they're attached to their fundamental religious or metaphysical beliefs. And that's a hard one, right, to get people to give up, at least in the short time frame of regulation that we're going to need to go through in order to create a climate where the good stuff out of this can come out and go into the market and and have the good effects that I think it can have, and that we can also be worried about the sort of the pie in the sky, this will solve all of our problems, and the kinds of things that Dick Manning was talking about last night. 3, the European experience with GM foods demonstrates a relationship between worries over the extrinsic claims and development of robust intrinsic claims like the unnatural objection. Now, one of the things I pointed out to you, a worry about the answers to the extrinsic objections is people can't keep these things straight in their heads. I mean, and that's completely understandable. What's the difference between this particular food pathogen, that emerges, and there actually are some interesting connections between delivery systems and all this kind of stuff about how this stuff fits together. But it's easy for people to be confused or to, in fact, be exploited into being confused about where a danger comes from. And so what people need, and you find this again and again and again in the literature, is some kind of regulatory confidence and some kind of public confidence in government science and also government-funded science, and that people really do have their best interests at heart. They don't want them to get sick just to make a buck, right? And if you look at the sort of the different, you go down country by country, I don't have time to do it now, and you look at certain countries in Europe which had a stronger perceived confidence, right, public confidence in science, you have less of the debate sort of being these naturalness, unnaturalness, these kinds of arguments that also may correlate with other kinds of factors that are important to talk about as well. And finally, I think as such it's much more difficult to answer, and I'm just repeating myself here, the satisfaction of those who hold the view, hold the naturalness view. We want to try to keep the debate from going wholesale over there because it's very difficult once the debate gets over there to really make sense of it and to do a sort of a morally responsible kind of public deliberation about it, which leaves most people happy and not leaving a lot of people sort of feeling they got the short end of the stick. At best, I think this will be amenable to what I'm going to call an opt-out strategy, which I'll explain in the next section. This is how one way I think we can deal with the intrinsic objections. Now, why should we take this stuff seriously? Well, here's the, the really kind of the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario, and we've seen vestiges of this, and of course this is not the main motivation we should worry about, though, Dick Cheney might. It's the terrorists win kind of argument, right? But a culture war. That when people really do feel that they don't have trust in their government to look out for their health and safety and environmental concerns, you tie this to the public movements around these questions, then you get people on the very fringes doing very radical things, and then closer in, just simply intransigence, right, about creating a framework where, again, we can have a healthy development of the technology. And the example I'll just point to, May 21st, 2001, my just recent campus, University of Washington, we had an urban horticulture center where they were not doing research on genetically modified trees. But Earth Liberation Front thought that they were. And they firebombed the facility along with a bunch of other facilities in Washington and Oregon. The trials have just recently finished about this. And we're just lucky that no one was harmed, right, in this particular case. And there are lots and lots of examples out there like this. Now, worst case scenario, we get into the intrinsic objections. What can we do there? And I think that these are not completely desperate because the solution I'm going to suggest for the intrinsic objections to GM foods and also for nanotechnology are also, I think, at the end of the day, going to be very, very positive for dealing with the extrinsic objections, the health and human safety objections when we get to them. So let's think about other sort of related, this is what philosophers do, let's think of some related worries, right, that seem to sort of share some elements of these kinds of concerns. And and what I want to call this is there's a class of arguments that are moral controversies. I'm going to call them deep disagreements, right? And deep disagreements are moral controversies that are characterized, like I think the GM food, at least part of it is characterized, by a metaphysical debate, a debate about the nature of reality and the implications of that, and not a straightforward question of figuring out the consequences or figuring out the facts of the matter or some other ways in which we might want to worry about, we might want to sort of approach certain kinds of moral problems under certain kinds of moral frameworks. The classic debate, of course, is abortion in the US. And the question that we ask in the US about abortion comes up again and again and again. It's part of the law. Is the human fetus a person? And if it is a person, what kind of moral status does it have? And by and large, right, the strongest correlate to your view on abortion is not political party, it's not particular religious views. Of course, these are indexed to this a lot. It's not socioeconomic status. It is how you respond to this question. If for some reason you think the fetus is a person, then you're more likely to say abortion is impermissible. If you think the fetus, if you think the fetus is a person, it's impermissible. If you think the fetus is not a person, then you think it's morally permissible, or it can be trumped by some other right. So these are sort of a very interesting intransigent debate. Now, how do we deal with these debates, at least in the American context, and certainly in other parts of the world as well? Two strategies. Generally, number one, we stipulate that one of these values, or one of these sides of the issue, one of these metaphysical views trumps the other for some reason, and we appoint someone to make that decision for us. This is what we did with abortion, right, with Roe v. Wade. So January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court says, permissible up through, and of course we've been eating away at this sort of slowly and surely over the years. Abortion is permissible up through the second trimester, not through the third trimester. It's an entirely arbitrary distinction, especially once you look at the technology. But nonetheless, we sort of said, okay, the highest court in the land decides this, and then we say that bodily self-determination of the woman trumps, generally speaking, plus a cluster of other rights trumps, right, the status, the moral status of the fetus, and then we know where that's gone in the US, and it still is not very positive, right? The second way we do this, though, and I think with some kinds of issues, where we have metaphysical views that are undergirding a set of cultural practices or moral norms, is we allow some space for people to opt out. Now, not all, I don't actually think the abortion debate is amenable to this kind of solution. So with more detail, I would sort of go into why I think that's the case, and maybe we can do that in questions. But the second example, I'll give this example, and this is one of my sort of examples. On my way from Montana to New York City, I stopped off in Binghamton, New York for a year. And it was bad for lots of reasons, which I won't go into. It was a very depressing place, and full of very depressed people who hated each other and blamed each other for their misery and woe. Enough said. So I was at SUNY Binghamton, and SUNY is, and I don't know, my friend Michael here could tell me, at the time SUNY Binghamton was, in the overall SUNY system, was the most competitive for undergrads to get into of all the SUNY systems. It was sort of designed originally to be like that, and then it sort of grew into this research university. And some of the best education, public education is downstate, New York City. And so you had a lot of kids from New York City who were coming up to SUNY Binghamton for their education, publicly funded university, a high proportion of Orthodox Jews, right? Up there. You've got this campus kind of on the edge of town, a town that's like doesn't have much by way of food that you'd want to eat. And so people stuck on campus, what do they eat, right? And the university says, okay, you got these people who have this view, this metaphysical intuition that there is a presence in the universe that cares whether or not you mix milk and meat and a bunch of other things, and uses public funds to create a kosher student cafeteria, right? Public university funds to do this to accommodate these people. Now, this seems like a great opting out strategy. It's not a concession that we agree with you about these views. And I'm Jewish myself, I'm just not Orthodox, so I don't hold, I don't believe these views, but I thought this was a fantastic solution, right? So that this is a very minor example of an opting out strategy. So you provide some sort of option so that people can at least, make the choices they want to without us having to accede to, and then we all sort of live together in a nice liberal pluralist universe. Okay, so that's sort of the other strategy. So the question we want to ask is, and in another version of this presentation, I go through long arguments for why I think these cases are similar, so we might want to save that for questions if you want. But to me, intuitively, the unnatural objection to GM foods is like a religious dietary restriction. What's the difference, really? Maybe the Orthodox Jews in Binghamton have an older book that they can point to, right? But that seems like that's not fair because genetic engineering is relatively recent. At least of the sort that people are worried about. So we don't have the textual support yet for the unnaturalness worry, but there is coherence, I think, in a certain sense. These are not, I would say, irrational views. The kosher eating view is not irrational, it's irrational. It's outside the bounds of rational. It's not about what's rational, right? It's about your fundamental moral commitments. As long as those don't interfere with someone else's, fine. You should be allowed. And that's the way we think about this under the conditions of liberal pluralism. So if I could make this argument, just bear with me and just accept it for the moment, that there is really a very strong similarity between these two objections. Is there an opting out strategy for GM foods, for this intrinsic objection? And I would say, yeah. And there's a bunch of different things that follow from that, the opting out strategy. First is just casuistry, which just means it's sort of the fancy philosophical term for punting on the theoretical issues and saying, we'll take this on a case-by-case basis, right? And we will sort of look at each particular application of GM and weigh the benefits and the costs and sort of in terms of its going forward. And we don't do this wholesale, it's all good, it's going to save your life, it's going to be great, it's going to sort of make us live forever, or it's all bad, it's all terrible, it killed you yesterday, which is sort of generally speaking, unfortunately crudely, how the debate sort of does unfold in the public. So we have to adopt some sort of casuistry which doesn't really give any favor to either side. Secondly, I think this requires labeling, right? Absolutely. I mean, you got to know what you're eating, right? And this is the problem. Now, there's a big debate actually a very small debate among a few philosophers about labeling. It's not a big debate. It's a big debate and it's an interesting debate. So it's a very interesting debate among philosophers about different forms of labeling for GM foods. And the worry, of course, is that negative labeling sounds like a warning. Warning contains GM foods. Positive labeling, though, sounds actually better. And the idea here is that you sort of, basically, you cede some positive label to the non-GM folks out there. And in fact, we did this in the US. And I played an extremely small part in the larger conversation about this. But you all know that in the last 4 years, the US Department of Agriculture has come up with an organic label, right? And it's an official USDA organic label. So you can't have GM content to get the organic label under a very, very small percentage, right? And so if you really want to be careful, if you take the unnatural objection very seriously, then you can just buy stuff that's organic, and you will actually, it's like a kosher, it's like the positive kosher, the kosher label, right, on food. And I think that's basically the right way to go. Of course, there are worries about this, and that we know there's lots of stuff that's labeled as natural and organic, which does not have the USDA label, so it's very confusing in the public. But I think it's about pretty much the same burden right, on someone who wants to avoid eating GM for whatever reason that a vegetarian or a vegan would have. You got to read the label. You got to ask the questions, right, to the guy in the restaurant. You just got to be careful, because you've got some moral view which gives you a prohibition, or a metaphysical view that gives you a prohibition on the way that you eat. And finally, and this is where we go back to the extrinsic objections, I will hammer this home again in a second, that we must constantly be vigilant about maintaining public confidence, so that worries over extrinsic objections do not become, right, in a sense, fuel for the fire for intrinsic objections. And these conversations are, with people in these public debates or in Congress are never nifty and clean, right? Lots of reasons are thrown out, one after another, and you have to really work hard to parse them apart. And so in rooms like this, we think carefully about how they parse apart, but we know they're all going to be lumped together in a big, messy lump, right? And then so we need to think about how they interrelate. And I think there is some interrelation here. And so it gives us just another reason, aside from all the other reasons we can have independently, why we want to sort of worry about public confidence. So nanotech, how are we doing on nanotech? And does this sort of a kind of a way of this intrinsic, extrinsic analysis help us for understanding nanotech? And then we'll do a check on what's actually going on the ground in Washington right now. So applications, and I'm sure you guys you all know this, but just a reminder, there's a whole lot of them out there now already on the market. Now these are not, this is not FDA approval stuff, right, which will go through a rigorous process, right? You don't get FDA approval for kitchen knives and teddy bears, right, and sunblock. And refrigerators, right? You don't get that. That doesn't go through that process. So that process is going to have to go through something else, right? And the burden is going to fall on EPA first of all. And so we're taking all this stuff. We've got about 800 products on the market right now, a $32 billion industry. You all know the sort of the contents of what's going into the stuff and how it works better than I do. It's out there in the world. If you've got an iPhone, don't eat it, is my sort of warning, because it's got some nano stuff in there, and we really don't know what this will do if you eat your iPhone, right? But more importantly, like when you put on the sunblocks and all this kind of stuff, we know it passes the blood-brain barrier, we know it goes into your system, and then we just don't know what happens. We're doing this real-time experiment on ourselves without any sort of, anyone signing any sort of form that says, I agree to be experimented on. We kind of did the same thing with GM food, so this is a problem. Where is it going into all the crazy, wonderful, interesting, bionic person stuff that's going to happen? This is important. Projected $2.5 trillion market by 2014. And I'll remind you of this date and this number in a second, because it's really important if we compare what's happening with nanotech to the rest of the history of technology. So all of that stuff. Now the problem, of course, with nanoethics, there is a journal of nanoethics, isn't there now? There must be. We'll start one this afternoon if there's not one, but there is a journal of nanoethics, I'm sure. And it's not itty-bitty ethicists. It's like people like trying to sort of figure out how it is that you do ethics appropriate to nanotechnology. And my worry is, like, when I start getting into this, because there's a lot of money in this if you haven't sort of figured this out yet, not only for the $1 trillion, but the good part is there's a lot of money, little portion of the National Nanotechnology Initiative money goes to social implications of science and technology, and I'm on one of the panels at NSF that gives away this money. But for us who have no overhead, we don't have labs, we do thought experiments, right? This is a lot to us. So we're sort of looking there, hold on one second, I'm on a roll. And so the worry is, when I started looking at this, is like to do a nanoethics, bioethics, you're talking about, life ethics, and environmental ethics, you're talking about the environment, vague, but medicine, business ethics, commerce, engineering ethics, building things. Nanoethics, this stuff has almost nothing in common when you look at the full range of what we can do with nanotechnology other than its scale, right? It's like someone saying, let's create a journal of the ethics of things that are 8 feet long, right? So it is damn frustrating, right? So think about what a nanoethics would look like. Yes?
It's the Journal of Nanoethics.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, good. That frees me up for the afternoon. So now, Dane's writing that grant in his head, like, yeah, I gotta Center for Ethics. Yeah. Okay, so we've got to break this stuff down. And I'll do a very crude breakdown over like 3 iterations. There will be many, many that you could break down in sort of different kind of things, moral issues that these raise. So one is, the kinds of moral questions involving nanotechnology which track these extrinsic objections about biotech, health and human safety, right, and environmental worries. And then the kinds of things that follow between that: equity, you produce the stuff, it's going to cause all these benefits, whatever they are. Even the short-term, the resistance to disease, the sort of simple stuff we're doing now, relatively speaking, and then this causes equity problems between countries. Those are kind of non-unique worries, and that doesn't mean they're bad worries. It just means that they're going to be of a piece with a lot of worries we have about chemical risk in general, right? So we can do this, I think. So that first generation nanotech, I don't think is going to necessarily raise these deep disagreements, these intrinsic worries, I don't think. I wouldn't forecast that they would, but I think we need to do experiments to sort of figure this out, and we can talk about later how I'm going to try to do this in the future. It will be resolved with more time, again, if public confidence is preserved about the technology. Then there's going to be the subset of nanotechnology, and here regulatory confidence is a bit higher on the extrinsic worries because this will go through FDA approval. But that's not going to account for that $2.5 trillion, all of it, not nearly all of it. A subset is going to be like GMOs. The potential for deep disagreement will come in appeals to folk notions of natural versus unnatural. But we already have this with medicine, non-nano-oriented medicine now. There are some people, because of their religious beliefs, that don't want certain kinds of procedures done to them, right? So we've got models to think about that, informed consent, this kind of thing. So this is a contentious distinction, but we'll call this therapeutic medical nanotechnology, the stuff that just cures the diseases that we are dealing with now. And that will raise questions over equity, right? And there will be maybe some unnatural worries, but I think they will probably be in the minority. And so I think this will be amenable to the opt-out. You just provide informed consent. You just let people decide whether they want it or not, because of whatever worries they may have, either extrinsic or intrinsic. Now the problem, of course, with this is if there's a big puzzle here that you want to just drive a truck through, which is anyone who knows the medical technology literature knows there's this tipping point, right? At a certain point, when we get the nanobots that go through your bloodstream that clear out your arteries and stuff, and it's so successful, then the doctor's going to say, okay, no more with the angioplasty, right? No more with the triple bypass. We just don't do that anymore because it's so much more dangerous, comparatively speaking, than what this stuff can do for you, and it's less invasive and all that. And then that starts to, and then plus insurance companies, right, are going to push this stuff, and then we start minimizing choice, and that will be unfortunate, but it'll be an interesting question we can look at later. Now, finally, my friend here, I don't know this friend, we put all this stuff in you, we make you better, stronger, faster, taller, sexier, whatever. And that's the enhancement medical nanotechnology. And the first thing we're going after is age, or at least that's the target. Davis Baird, Christopher's former colleague at University of South Carolina, who's one of the real leaders of the nanoethics stuff. Conquering aging would do much more than produce technical problems of overpopulation. It would radically impact. Is that clock stuck?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but oddly enough, it is that time now. Excellent. Right. All right. So, would do much more than produce technical problems of overpopulation. It would radically impact our understanding of what it means to be a human, of how individual and group interests work in concert with or at cross purposes with each other. The reality of death drives one generation's interests forward to another generation. And there's just lots of philosophy about this stuff that we can talk about. And important here is that will raise questions over equity, obviously, and also definitely raises whole questions about human hubris. I mean, literally there, it's not, creating life, but recreating what it means to be human, and that's going to cause some big, big problems down the road. That sounds like culture war material for me. To me, I think there's some reliable ways we could forecast whether or not that might be possible. There's some interesting things we can do that we're not doing yet. But we can see, like, on the horizon, it's already kind of started. And you look at things like this in the popular literature, Bill McKibben versus Kurzweil, Ray Kurzweil, with Bill McKibben saying, enough already, this is his liberal Christian view, we're destroying what it means to be human, this has all these bad consequences, and so, and this is also of a piece with these broader social movements that are very influential, environmentalism, and the sort of, the sort of the slow food, living simply, and, all that sort of stuff we get in the US that sort of emerged out of Thoreau. And then on the other hand, Ray Kurzweil, who, is Ray Kurzweil, and Ray's like, 50 years, you just got to live 50 years, then you can live forever, right? And who wouldn't want to do that? And they go back and forth. Now, so there is this horizon of nanotechnology that I'm deeply worried about, regardless of how good those FDA regulations are. Now we go back to those extrinsic objections. Where are we with respect now, at the very, very beginning of this whole process? Where are we with setting that right, public regulatory environment, public confidence in the science and the safety as the very first step before we even get to these, crazy questions about life extension and the, recreating the human, all that. We are so far behind, I can't even tell you, at least in this country. It is a disaster. Number one observation, the business climate for nanotechnology is already ahead, right, of any of these projections. Here's a study, fairly reliable study comparing nanotech, the development of nanotech to other computer, automobile, railroad, textiles, and we have these paths. So we don't know where we're going with nanotech, and there are some questions about how reliable or, how much we should rely on our speculations about this stuff, given that it's still like, it's kind of science fiction-y. But we can look at what's happened in the past, and you get this sort of pattern. Introduction to technology, right? And then along widespread adoption, where most of the stuff's going to come on the market, the applications, the implications are going to be hotly debated, and then end of rapid growth phase, and it's just part of life. And then you're just there, right? And then you're in that world where you can't live without a phone, and they built all the highways, and like trying to roll back the clock on that infrastructure is just hellishly difficult, as we know from climate change issues and thinking about transportation. We are projecting a $2.5 trillion industry by 2014. That's before you even get to widespread adoption. This is the most, the best of the many studies I think that I've sort of seen on this kind of stuff. So we are way behind if we think about what the numbers are going to be like and what the implications in everyday life are going to be when we actually get to the widespread adoption phase. So, I mean, we're already behind, unless like the government's really looking out for interest and is on top of this, and of course they're not. So number two, we got to think about the public risk and public perception. David Rajewski, director of, do people know this, the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies at the Woodrow Wilson Center? It's the best thing going out there on this. And they're not, ideological about this. They're not, anti-nanotech at all. You can track every single product that's there's like 800 products on the market now. You can track every single one. You can find out, the whole history of the thing. They're gee-whiz enthusiasts just as much as anyone. David Rajewski, testifying before the Senate, and I'll talk about the context in a second. Public trust is the dark horse in nanotechnology's future. If government and industry do not work to build public confidence in nanotech, consumers may reach for the no nano label in the future, right? And then he reminds us of the obvious recent memory parallel, EU ban on genetically modified foods, which is costing American farmers $300 million per year. Now what's the context? This is April 24th, this is just this past spring, 2008. Encourage you to go on the web and watch this whole, there's like 6 hours of testimony. John Kerry's subcommittee, right, of Commerce holds these hearings. The Government Accounting Office, this came out right after the Government Accounting Office, big watchdog, or the economic watchdogs, the guys who are supposed to not really care about, things like health and human safety and the environment, right, are reporting that the National Nanotechnology Initiative only spends 3%, right, of its billions of dollars in funding since Clinton authorized it on environmental health and safety, EHS. GAO looks at this number, right? They look at this number and they say, bullshit. In fact, if you look at the report, I've got it here. Oops, sorry. I've got it here. You look at this report, and the problem is if you start going through the appendices very carefully and they list all of the grants they've given out on environmental health and safety, most of them are grants to people doing nanotech research to figure out how to mitigate environmental problems, how to use nanotech to clean up some toxic waste. It's not about the environmental health and safety of nanotech itself, right? So GAO already, the conservatives say, this small number is totally exaggerated. Now, this is not philosophers complaining about, we're not getting enough for ethics and legal, social issues. This is like the safety stuff, right? The heart of public confidence. January 28th, 2008, right? Let's go back a little bit. Why is all this, to raise the context, EPA, after a lot of people begging them to do something about this, to sort of come up with some rules and start testing stuff on nanotech. Because what do you guys all know, right? You all know that the cool thing about nanotechnology is you take these stuff we've been working with for a long time, in some cases thousands of years, right? If you go back and you look at the nanoparticles that were put in glass in ancient Greece and stuff, it's really cool. Stuff at this scale behaves differently. It has different properties that emerge. It has different capabilities. It's going to have potentially different consequences to health and human safety. That's why it's interesting. That's why we have to look at it, even when we're dealing with something like, some silver particles that we've been working with for a long time. And EPA says two things when they finally announced their rule. Number one, we will have a program where companies are invited to voluntarily submit safety data on what they're doing, what they're already putting on products on the market in teddy bears, for God's sakes, out there. It will voluntarily submit data, and then we'll start sort of building a database around it. And not surprisingly, as of today, no one has done this, right? Secondly, EPA also notes that it will not change its policy on what constitutes a new chemical under the Toxic Safety Control Act. That policy put forward last year says the agency will not consider size when deciding when a chemical is a new chemical under TSCA, even though size is a determining factor in what constitutes a nanomaterial, right? So this is about as bad as you could imagine. I mean, it's actually not as bad. I mean, climate change was a bit worse because it was like la 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 la. There is no climate, right? It's like that level of subtlety. At least they acknowledge the stuff is there, right? But it's sort of like that. And then look at, and so the conclusion I have here is that the U.S. regulatory response is, I think, morally irresponsible given the stuff I've talked about before, and unhealthy, obviously, for this rapidly emerging business climate. If you want to get to that $2.4 trillion a year, you better make sure there's not this no-nano reaction that occurs because of some real or imagined implication. Because in Europe, it was imagined, in large part. And then if you were doubt, right, just look at who's signing up on each side of this issue, right? You don't need to work in a school of public policy to figure this one out. What does industry say? Fantastic, right? What do the lobbyists say? Well done. Good, nicely done. Thank you very much. And the watchdogs, of course, are going ballistic. The poor guys at Woodrow Wilson down the street from where my Center for American Progress, their heads are popping off, right? Clarence Davis, the agency's current oversight approach is inadequate to deal with nanotechnology. It is essential that EPA move quickly to recognize the novel biological and ecological characteristics of nanoscale materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Be happy to, I don't want to read through all this, but it's exactly what you might imagine. So this is the little footnote here. This sounds a hell of a lot like climate change, right? On at least two things. The administration denial of the scientific consensus, right? And this stupid idea that has been proved to them wrong again and again, that a lack of regulation improves a business environment when there's no reason to believe otherwise. And that's the business environment on producing new energy to deal with climate change, all that kind of stuff that we should have been way ahead of, right? But we're behind on now. Okay, are there any alternatives? I'm just going to run you up to almost the present day. Good news. In fact, actually the present day. I will run you up to the present day. Good news. National Nanotechnology Initiative does their report, right? Strategy for nanotechnology-related environmental health and safety research. Bad news. The GAO testimony I told you about. Good news. The U.S. House of Representatives goes, okay, this looks bad. We ought to do something about it. And they have the head of the science committee is a fantastic guy. There are also wonderful people in that subcommittee now. They're doing a bang-up job. They're getting nowhere for a reason I'll explain to you in a second, but they are ahead of the curve on this. So in May 1st of '08, this passes in a week, right? May 1st of '08, we get the National Nanotechnology Initiative Amendments Act of 2008. This is the reauthorization of the big bill, right? This will really set the tone. Three encouraging things. Number one, explicit funding of a coordination office. If you know NNI, it's kind of chaotic because the funds are spread over 25 separate agencies. There's very little coordination. And this is a problem when you're dealing with something that needs coordination like environmental health and safety. Number two, it requires that this new coordinating office develop a public database about environmental health and safety and a bunch of other stuff, including the ethical, legal, and social implications. So this is good. Three, most importantly, creates an associate director from the White House Office of Science and Technology, who will fulfill the role of coordinator of the social dimensions component of NNI. Will make sure that next time one of these is done, it's a lot more substantive than this one is. Right? So that's all good. That passes the House. We get that through. Bad news. Senate is not passing it because Tom Coburn of Oklahoma is holding up this piece of legislation along with like 15 other bills that Harry Reid, the Democratic head of the Senate, tried to push through right at the very end of the last legislative session. So it's stalled out. So there is the upside to that is, right, and Don knows this more than anyone else in the room, hopefully this will mean that it won't go forward so Bush can veto it, and then we can wait for the next administration to maybe do something about it. Good news. National Academy of Sciences, that's us, right? Good guys, have impaneled a committee to review the NNI Environmental Health and Safety Report and make independent recommendations to Congress. So that's very good. The bad news, NAS panels have no power, right? So the smartest people in the country looking at this stuff who know it the best are not empowered to do anything about it, right? A lot of NAS studies, unfortunately, just kind of get shelved and they disappear. Although they are this document, you can go back and say, I told you so. This document is about done, and I don't know whether it's good news or not, but I'm going to be one of the reviewers of it at the end of August, and so I'll be able to see this. And I do know that it's extremely critical of the NNI approach so far. So it will support all the stuff that Congress wants, the House Committee on Science wants to see. The good news, though, is there is a really interesting possibility here, right? There have been cases, and say what you can disagree with me about the conclusion of the story I'm going to tell you, the very short story, and then we'll get questions. We have cases where NAS is empowered by Congress and given teeth. And the best example that I know of is Yucca Mountain. So, the National, Long-Term Geologic Repository for Nuclear Waste. And here's the way it sort of worked, briefly. 1982, we get some extremely good legislation as far as these things can be compared. In 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, right? This is Reagan administration. Directing the Department of Energy to find and design a site for permanent geologic disposal of nuclear waste. So the question is, what do we do with 300 million pounds of nuclear waste? How do we sort of make that? And we know all the sort of the energy implications and business implications of why we need, right, this long-term repository. And we've got we got 150 million pounds out there now in the world, or in the US, right? And then, so the expectation is, let's double that, we'll build a facility that's safe enough for all that. In 1992, so that 82 is like, basically sets up the search for a place to put this stuff. There are 3 finalists, someplace in Texas with a funny name, the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the state of Washington, and Yucca Mountain. They decide on Yucca Mountain. 1992 then, the Congress goes back and says, okay, now we're going to make EPA and the Nuclear Regulatory Agency look at Yucca Mountain and come up with some criteria for what will be a safe repository for this stuff. And here is the most important thing. This part of the legislation requires EPA to promote public health and safety standards based upon and consistent with the foundings and recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences. So that's power, right? And that's power you can take not to the bank, but to court, which is where this wound up. 1995, NES releases their study, 50 engineers and scientists, and the key issue right now becomes whether or not you're going to build a facility, as EPA wanted to build, that would meet individual risk standards to 10,000 years in the future, or 1 million years in the future, right? And NES says it is feasible to do this, and there is no good reason to pick 10,000 years as your safety standard for building Yucca Mountain. And this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it becomes the raw material for a 2004 U.S. Court of Appeals case in the one of the most conservative districts in the country, the D.C. district, which is where all the regulatory law cases go. And this is the operative passage. I won't read the whole thing, but basically says, EPA, you're supposed to listen to what the National Academy of Sciences did. You're supposed to build a facility to their specifications. There's extremely good reasons for this. Those of you who might know this stuff better than I do can explain chemically how this works. But a lot of the stuff that's going into this toxic soup we're putting in the Nevada desert actually gets more dangerous after 10,000 years, right? Becomes more dangerous after that period. And so you really want to sort of build a facility that's at least going to get through that hump of radioactivity that occurs in the middle of the life cycle of some of these some of this stuff. And so the court says you're not putting anything down there, right? Because the scientists told you 1 million years was your outside safety margin, and you insisted on 10,000. Now, why is this important? Because I think there are actually pieces out there in the world. You're going to have an NES study. You're going to have a Congress which is extremely positively disposed to the NES process in this particular instance. You got a new administration coming in. You got a lot of elements where, in fact, we could create that climate for positive public confidence in what we're going to do with nanotech, opposed to what the administration has wound up doing, and then I think put the right context out there to answer the extrinsic objections, which I think will become the bulwark to having a sane discussion about the intrinsic objections when they arise, and allowing for creating that space where, we can opt out if we want to. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Christopher. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'm particularly interested in the GM debate, and I thought it was interesting that you said that the casuistry and positive labeling should be adequate so you can answer the objection.
Not adequate, but just a beginning. Yeah, I think you're also going to need you're going to need to encourage things like geographically isolated regions to have a ban on GM in order to produce foodstuffs where you don't get migration in from other fields and stuff like that. So. Good.
That's like a big free market thing. I don't know. So I guess I'm just wondering, where should we go? How do we solve this thing?
It's the geographical isolation. There's a market change. You got to encourage people to do this. Like New Zealand has a great opportunity. They haven't gone very far down this road yet compared to other places. They could make much more money, selling GM-free crops to Japan than they could be selling stuff that potentially is either going to appear to or actually be, contaminated. And I don't, sorry to use that term. I don't think it's necessarily bad stuff, right? Or with GM material. And there are other sort of, you don't have to pick an island nation. You can sort of pick other sort of places also that are sort of more isolated, And that just really isn't entering into the debate yet about the economics of this as much as it should. I mean, there are people out there who are making the claim they should. So, solving the worries about the intrinsic objections?
That's kind of what I'm concerned about, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to do, and it's sort of, when I got my public policy hat on, then it sort of here's a whole menu, right? And when I'm doing philosophy, then I'm really going to dig into there's this really interesting philosophical debate over positive labeling versus negative labeling, which takes in all these sorts of interesting issues about liberty and stuff. And that requires sort of much longer sort of answer. But I think that I will stick by those as the kind of answers we need. And so for that reason, I was really glad when we won the USDA organic label fight. Because it was close. I mean, there were congressmen from Georgia, putting all sorts of wacky stuff in there about what to protect their home industries, to give them the ability to have, say, USDA organic. It wasn't always GM stuff. It was sort of other things that people wanted to put in there, which was just crazy, And so it requires that kind of trench warfare on these kinds of possible policy solutions. But do you? you're not satisfied.
I guess it's frustrating to me because I see organic as being more about like sustainability, and I think at least some types of genetically engineered foods could fit into that model.
I do too.
Enhance sustainability.
I
but
do
we
too.
cut it out.
I do too, but I think this is where a choice has to be made, and I think this is because of these worries, and how far along. I think the culture war, right, has gotten on this. I think that this is the best solution, all things considered. People will still be doing research, and kind of stuff like this. And we're talking about, it's going to break down different ways. People are still going to do GM for bioremediation and all that kind of stuff. And that is something where the environmental movement, I believe, has to just get over it and stop this sort of knee-jerk, all GM is bad, because a lot of that stuff will be our best choice when it comes to, pollution issues. So. Oh, okay.
Just to comment on the intrinsic objections of people to GM. So I just thought of it when you were talking that when you're comparing it with a traditional crossbreeding that farmers used to do earlier, and that's actually what happens when you're introducing another new gene into a plant. There is one check that when you're doing a traditional breeding, your nature actually accepts it because you do the crossbreeding and then you grow it in the soil, and there's a check by nature on whether this is a sustainable way to go or not. But when you're doing it in the laboratory, you're introducing a gene and then you're forcing it into a particular soil condition, or it's a little more unnatural. So I can kind of see that as being one of the I don't know, whatever you define it as being one of the reasons why people may have a more intrinsic objection to why this is not a rational reason for reasoning out that, this traditionally was done this way and this is exactly what we're doing. We're not exactly doing it. There's the amplitude is more.
Well, what I wanted to compare, that's good, but what I must have misspoke because I wasn't going to compare genetic engineering with what you've just described, but genetic engineering with high-tech, laboratory-intensive, non-GM, right, plant breeding. The stuff that the guys in the big agronomy labs at North Carolina State do, That's what I'm sort of saying is, that was the argument that I sort of seen rolled out is, this can't be unnatural because if you can't claim that this is unnatural and this is natural, what's going on in labs like that, or what was actually going on in the Urban Horticulture Center at Washington. And I'm not defending what happened, any stretch of the imagination, but it was not surprising that people were confused about what was going on. And there was also a kind of moral blindness about willingness to even sort of see the differences. So that's the sort of the thing that I'm talking about. And then I kind of this is where I kind of punt. This is a very important philosophical tool if you haven't learned it yet. Punt. And I'm going to say, I don't even, right, you think that what the small farmers are doing is natural, that's great, and I don't want to have that conversation. And I'm happy to live in a world where you can have that view, and I might have a lot of objections, which I don't really feel like I need to raise at the moment. And I think that's a good environment. In the back?
I have a question about the sort of opt-out concept, especially in terms of nanotechnology, because how does that address the issue of you can choose not to purchase it, but that does not by any means guarantee you won't be exposed? Just because of the circumstances. And GM sort of has this, but
right.
I think sort of nano is on a different scale because we're talking about groundwater and
all kinds of stuff. I know it's incredibly complicated, and it might be the case that there just is no satisfactory opt-out strategy, but what I wanted to do was sort of at least try to segregate these things. I think there can be an opt-out strategy on the enhancement medical stuff. And it can come in a bunch of different ways, some of which you'll like and some of which you won't. One way that we've done an opt-out with stem cells, right? And a bunch of bioethicists advised Bush, right, to basically have a global, federal government opt-out. We are just not going to participate on that because of, and I think there's a lot of reasons why it was a very bad move, But nonetheless, there are these moments where we can sort of say we anticipate so many, huge disparities between the superhumans who will live in the future and, the Ray Kurzweils, living forever. Can you imagine? I mean, just it's like you get points for being insufferable, and then you get to live forever. And then and then on the other hand, it's and then the rest of us who are just we won't have the benefit of 100,000-year investment portfolio, right? So So like, you know, think of the mortgage you can get if you're going to live to be 500, right? So the I mean, you can buy a lot of house, right, with that. Those kinds of things, I think, I mean, we need to have a conversation before we get there, right? And see if there are, like we did with human cloning, you know, and see if we do want to sort of say, all things considered, we just don't want to get to that place where we have this kind of debates. Now, when you're talking about, you know, I'm hopeful that the intrinsic objections won't come up, right, with respect to the, you know, the stuff being in the water. It will be, really will be health and human safety. Because I think if it's in the water, what people are going to be worried about more is the safety issues, right? And then I think then it's just like you need a better regulatory climate than the one we have here. And I think that's you know, we can actually have a conversation about that, right? In terms that I think aren't going to get as sort of excited, I think, as we would with others.
I'm a little bit more skeptical than you are. Like in Michigan and other states in the US, RBST has been disallowed, not by the public or the government, but by the processors.
Mm-hmm.
Like BST is the bovine growth hormone.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been, for I think at least 10 years, a common practice on US dairy farms to use this growth hormone. And then it's been proven to be scientifically safe. And then the public didn't have the uproar. It was actually the processors like Kroger's and Walmart and all those food chains or grocery chains in Michigan and other states that kind of said, hey, we don't want this milk anymore from you, and we only want those BST-free milk. But then, so then all the milk plants said, hey, we don't have the market for those RBST milk anymore. So if you want to ship your milk to us, you got to be BST-free. So I think it's kind of a step backwards and a little bit more closer to the European way of thinking, but not from the public, but by the processors.
Right. I think. Well, the one thing I'll say is, like, yeah. I mean, it's sort of there are a lot more players involved in this, and one of the big players on GM corn, for example, are the American Corn Growers Association. There's two major corn growers associations. One of them was pro-GM, one of them was extremely anti-GM, and they are worried about being beholden to Monsanto and all the sort of interesting reasons about that. So there are going to be a lot more players as number one, and then I haven't looked at RBST since I was a postdoc, 10 years ago. So I don't know what's going on with the current arguments about RBST, and what I would want to know is sort of what is the benefit that's coming out of that? How good is it for the producers? How good is it for the animals themselves? That's something that I would fold into the question, And then, are we always going to get the right outcome? Certainly not. But I do think the Europeans at least are right. I mean, the thing is, I do think the precautionary principle system is better than the one we have here. I do think that because of other reasons, namely, the big political pressure being put on the EU by the public, is corrupting that process as well. And we just want to avoid getting to that kind of caustic, we're panicking, and then we're forced to make a decision kind of context. So.
Well, my concern is if you have a scientifically safe procedure or a management tool or whatever you want to call it, and then RBST might be only the first one in a step of line or in a line where,
to get to something really, really, really good. Yeah. I agree, but that we could. The question that I would have then is: could there be a way of funding science, right, that gets you the development in the lab of that stage, which might potentially get to something that really needs to get out there, which does provide a better solution than the solutions that we have, rather than something that might only provide a market advantage to certain firms. So that's the worry I have about GM, is that a lot of GM stuff out there that I've looked at is only oriented towards providing market advantage to certain firms. There's a lobby to make genetically modified grapes that you can grow in Florida, as if we have this huge wine shortage in America, right? And it's just nuts, and I don't think we really need it. And given the kind of blowback, why is it that we want to sort of go there? And yeah.
How do we get groups like the regulatory groups like the EPA to change or modify their entrenched position that we obviously don't agree with?
We fire the current EPA administrator, we replace him with someone who's sane.
That works. And how do we do that before they actually create the entrenched position that we then have to fight against?
You know, I think that that basically people were just asleep on this issue, and it did not have even I mean, we have to do something on the order. The scientific community must do something on the order of what the atmospheric science community did on climate change, right? It has to be that public. It has to be that loud. I don't know if it can be, given, you know, climate change, of course, you know, captures the public imagination and stuff, you know, and if I can't think of a good joke. I was trying to think of some extremely boring politician doing, you know, an inconvenient truth part 2, nanotechnology, back to bite you in the ass, right? Something like that. You know, but it has to be something like that. I mean, this is unfortunately the world that we live in now, and hopefully it will change with the new administration, either one, McCain or Obama, and where it doesn't have to be this constant, like, you know, God damn it, open the door and like let us in and like listen to what we're saying. You know, where scientists have to actually hit that sort of awful point where they're going to go, look, we're not supposed to be advocates. We're just supposed to be doing the research. But in the current climate, what we've seen up until now, it's required something like that. And so the good news, I think, is that now people are paying attention, you know, in Congress and stuff, and the right people are giving testimony. And so I think that at least this problem I do have some hope on.
So more philosophical. So I liked your analogy to the kosher food labeling, that sort of thing. That was very compelling when you first said it. But then I'm sort of wondering whether it's exactly analogous, because with the kosher labeling idea is that Jews get to decide what food is Jewish food. There's not really much of a concession there. It's saying you have your own definition of something that's based on your culture, so that's entirely. It would be completely ridiculous for them to not decide what kosher food is. Whereas I'm wondering if it would be too much of a philosophical concession to say, you're complaining, there are groups that are complaining about certain genetically modified foods, and so we'll just sell them or give them the right to say, we decide what's natural. And so you're making this concession to this concept that everyone uses, whether we like it or not. They want to talk about natural things or things that are consistent with nature or God's plan, whatever it is, and say, okay, well, you can just have it. And I'm worried as a philosopher that just giving away our common philosophical property like that is there's something problematic.
I agree. There is something problematic, and it is a kind of a triage kind of move on my part. You know, I mean, I think that it's kind of unfortunately the sort of the situation we find ourselves in. It's part of the reason, like, I won't go towards negative labeling because I certainly don't think that's warranted at all. I mean, I really do agree with that, and that would be completely inconsistent with the casualty approach, which it assumes there's going to be some really good GM products that are going to be reduced and sort of, you know, are good for whatever you want to say counts as good for more than just Monsanto, right? More than just Monsanto stockholders. So I think there's lots of good public welfare issues out there on that. Are there big differences? I think, yeah. I mean, it is just sort of this, it's more loosey-goosey. It's not, you know, kind of, you know, it's not. But then again, expand the analogy and let's talk about vegetarians. Let's talk about, you know, people who have more, you know, ambiguous kind of views that we seem to want to allow room for, right? You know, or at least provide options, or, you know, what have you, and we can imagine, especially in the court of law, right, where, you know, stuff that would be sufficient to get like legal protection for some kind of minority status and something like that. You know, if you had a school lunch program or some, you know, or you have to sort of do some interesting machinations to get exactly the right case, but you can come up with some case law which would even give protection for sort of like very sort of strange minority views like that aren't even as well kind of founded. So, but I think you can get there. We would have to have a longer conversation about that. But I think it's important to realize that ambiguity in order to thinking about how, when you're sort of doing the practical application of it, why, you know, you want a certain kind of regulatory framework rather than another one, you know. We'll let Don have the last question anyway. Go ahead.
This was with regards to a question that was asked earlier with regards to products that have nanoparticles available in the market. Okay, consider yourself as the API administrator.
Yep.
And let me cite an example. We do know that there are clothing, socks, which do have the property of not giving out bad odor because of the coating of silver nanoparticles on them.
Right.
Now these particles are considered to be bacteriostatic materials. And studies have shown that while doing laundry or anything else, along with the wash, these nanoparticles get removed. And they flow all the way to the ocean or to the sewage.
Right.
And studies have also shown that these nanoparticles have the tendency of breaking down, destroying
Right.
the organic bacteria.
Absolutely.
That's very much important, so as to maintain that cycle.
Right.
So the case is coming before you. How would you approach that situation?
I would test the stuff the same way I would test some new chemical that's being introduced into some consumer product, and then I would do a rigorous environmental impact statement. I would at least do the minimum that we would do for some new substance, and to sort of take into account, and panel the right people to look at that issue, and then give me a recommendation. And if the recommendation says, and we've done this before, the recommendation says, well, usually the recommendation says, well, there was some flaw in our previous study, we've got new information. In this case, we didn't have that previous study, so now we got new information, and then you do product recalls, right? If there is this big problem, if there really is an environmental problem, and the problem is just now we do not know. We don't even have the first little baby step into that process, right? And then will there be a difference between John McCain's head of EPA and Barack Obama's? I'm sure there will be, but I am more or less confident that no matter who it is, they will be willing at least to take that up if Congress puts the right pressure on them. And all it's going to take at this point now is for that vote to get through the Senate, and then we have really a very strong weapon. And can we get Don and then?
It'll just be a quick one.
Very quick one.
Where is Europe on the nanotechnology regulation? Does REACH, the REACH program about, will that affect nanotechnology issues? Are they further along in thinking about how to do the risk assessment?
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
They have a more ambitious, because they've got that precautionary model and they've got a more ambitious model to look at it. And they have not yet made, they haven't, they're not yet, at least, I think there is some room, there's some wiggle room on this, and I don't know which way it's going to go, and there's really different national approaches, as you always get with the EU, depending on who's got the strongest industry profile. But they at least have not yet announced that they're not going to do new testing on stuff. So, yeah.
Thank you.